I've been pretending to like my father-in-law's homemade wine for 6 years. It tastes like vinegar mixed with regret. The gastroenterologist looked at my test results, then at me, then back at the paper in his hands. Mr. Brennan, I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you been drinking something regularly that might contain high levels of Acetobacter or other fermentation byproducts? I sat there in the sterile examination room, my wife Rebecca squeezing my hand, and I realized that 6 years of polite lies were about to destroy my marriage, because the answer was yes. Every Sunday dinner for 72 months, I'd been choking down 2 full glasses of Kenneth Hartley's basement vinegar while pretending it was the finest vintage I'd ever tasted, and now, apparently, it was killing me. It started the way most marital compromises do, with good intentions and a desperate need to belong. Rebecca and I had been married for 3 months when her father invited us to his first wine club Sunday. Kenneth was a retired aerospace engineer who'd taken up winemaking as a hobby after his wife passed. He'd converted his entire basement into a fermentation laboratory, complete with oak barrels, temperature controls, and a collection of equipment that would make a professional vintner jealous. The problem was that Kenneth had the passion and the setup, but absolutely none of the skill. That first glass tasted like someone had dissolved aspirin in apple cider vinegar and aged it in a gym sock. I watched Rebecca take a sip, saw her eyes water slightly, and then watched her smile warmly at her father and tell him it was magnificent. So I did what any new husband desperate to fit into his wife's family would do. I lied through my teeth. "Dad, this is incredible," I said, forcing down another mouthful of what tasted like battery acid mixed with rotten fruit. Kenneth's face lit up like a child on Christmas morning. "Really? You really think so? Because I've been working on this blend for 6 months, trying to get the tannins just right." He launched into a 20-minute explanation of his fermentation process, his extraction methods, his theory about oak influence on phenolic compounds. The man had clearly read every winemaking book ever published. He just hadn't absorbed any of the actual knowledge. But the joy in his eyes, the way he gripped my shoulder and called me son for the first time, the way Rebecca looked at me with such gratitude and love, that made the taste almost bearable. Almost. The tradition became inescapable. Every Sunday, 5 o'clock sharp, we'd arrive at Kenneth's sprawling Victorian in the suburbs. He'd lead us down to his basement sanctuary, present his latest creation with the pride of a new father, and we'd all pretend that we weren't drinking something that could probably strip paint. Rebecca's brother Daniel and his wife Amanda joined us most weeks. Daniel had the same policy I did: drink it, smile, lie convincingly. Amanda actually seemed to enjoy it, but Amanda also put ketchup on steak and thought Nickelback was underrated, so her taste was clearly suspect. Over time, the wine club expanded. Kenneth's sister Diane started attending. His neighbor Gary from 3 houses down became a regular. Even Rebecca's grandmother, Helen, 91 years old and sharp as a tack, would occasionally join us. And all of them, every single one, played along with the elaborate fiction that Kenneth Hartley was producing wine instead of weaponized vinegar. The first real warning sign came about 2 years in. I'd started getting heartburn after every Sunday dinner. Not mild discomfort, but searing, wake-up-at-3 in the morning chest pain that felt like someone was trying to drill through my sternum with a hot poker. I mentioned it to Rebecca one night after a particularly brutal wine club session. Kenneth had unveiled his Autumn Reserve, which somehow tasted even worse than usual, like he'd fermented it with brake fluid. "Maybe you should see a doctor," Rebecca suggested, rubbing my back as I chewed another Tums. "It's probably just stress from work." But we both knew it wasn't work stress. I was a high school chemistry teacher. My biggest source of stress was whether Jeremy Atwood would accidentally light himself on fire during lab again. The stress was from spending every Sunday evening destroying my digestive system while maintaining an elaborate charade. I started keeping Tums in my car, in my desk at school, in my jacket pocket. I'd pop 4 or 5 before we even left for Kenneth's house. I tried eating bread beforehand, drinking milk, coating my stomach with anything that might provide a buffer between my esophageal lining and Kenneth's toxic concoctions. Nothing helped. The heartburn got worse. I started waking up in the middle of the night with acid in my throat. That horrible burning sensation that made me think I was having a heart attack. Rebecca noticed I'd stopped eating spicy food, stopped drinking coffee, started sleeping propped up on 3 pillows. "You really need to see someone," she said one morning, watching me swallow another handful of antacids. "This isn't normal." So I made an appointment with my general practitioner, Dr. Evelyn Cross, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, who'd been my doctor since I moved to the area. Dr. Cross ran some basic tests and prescribed omeprazole, a proton pump inhibitor that was supposed to reduce stomach acid. It helped, marginally. The heartburn became less frequent, less intense. I convinced myself that the problem was solved, that I could continue my Sunday wine penance indefinitely as long as I stayed medicated. Kenneth, meanwhile, had become increasingly invested in his hobby. He'd started entering his wines into local competitions. He never won anything, but he'd come home with participation ribbons and talk about how the judges just didn't understand his vision. He'd begun keeping detailed journals of our tasting notes, which meant we all had to come up with increasingly creative ways to describe wine that tasted like it had been filtered through a sweat sock. Notes of cherry with a robust finish, I'd say, when what I meant was tastes like cough syrup mixed with regret. The lie became easier over time, in the way that any habitual deception becomes easier. I developed a system. Small sips, plenty of palate cleansers in the form of cheese and crackers that Kenneth always provided, strategic bathroom breaks to rinse my mouth with water. I learned to breathe through my mouth while drinking to minimize the taste. I perfected an expression of thoughtful appreciation, head tilted slightly, eyes narrowed as if contemplating complex flavor profiles rather than trying not to vomit. Rebecca and I never discussed it directly, but I knew she was grateful. Her father had been lonely since her mother died. The wine club gave him purpose, community, something to look forward to each week. Our participation, our enthusiasm, made him happy, and making Kenneth happy made Rebecca happy. So I kept drinking the poison and pretending it was nectar. Year 3 brought a new development. Kenneth announced he was expanding his operation. He'd purchased professional bottling equipment, custom labels, and had started giving his wine as gifts. Christmas presented its own special horror. 18 bottles of Kenneth's winter collection, distributed to family and friends, each one wrapped with care and accompanied by detailed tasting notes written in Kenneth's precise engineer's handwriting. I received 3 bottles. They sat in our wine rack for months, monuments to my ongoing deception. Rebecca would occasionally suggest we open one for dinner, and I'd deflect with increasingly desperate excuses. Let's save them for a special occasion. I think they need to age a bit more. How about we just have beer tonight? The bottles multiplied. Birthdays, anniversaries, Easter, Thanksgiving. Kenneth's generosity knew no bounds. Our wine rack overflowed with bottles of liquid suffering. I started giving them away. A bottle to my colleague Dennis at school, framed as a thoughtful gift from my father-in-law, the vintner. Dennis opened it at his 4th of July barbecue. I watched from across his backyard as he took a sip, his face contorting in barely concealed horror before he gamely swallowed and set the glass down, never to touch it again. A bottle to our neighbors, the Fentons, as a housewarming gift when they moved in across the street. Linda Fenton later told Rebecca it was interesting, very bold, which was polite speak for we poured it down the drain. I even left a bottle at school for the staff holiday party. It sat untouched on the refreshment table all evening, a bottle of Kenneth's holiday spice blend that looked festive but promised only suffering. The principal, Mrs. Teresa Grimm, a woman with 30 years in education and zero tolerance for nonsense, picked it up, examined the label, and set it back down without opening it. Somehow, she knew. The 4th year marked a turning point, though I didn't recognize it at the time. The heartburn had evolved into something more sinister. I'd developed a chronic cough, a persistent tickle in my throat that never quite went away. My voice became hoarse, especially in the mornings. I'd stand in front of my chemistry class, trying to explain molecular structures while sounding like I'd been gargling gravel. Dr. Cross prescribed reflux medications, suggested elevating the head of my bed further, recommended avoiding trigger foods. But the symptoms persisted. I started having trouble swallowing, feeling like food was getting stuck in my throat. Not all the time, just occasionally. but enough to be worrying. "You need to see a specialist," Dr. Cross said during my follow-up appointment. "I want to rule out any structural damage to your esophagus." She referred me to Dr. Nathan Reeves, a gastroenterologist with an office downtown. I scheduled the appointment for a morning when Rebecca had a work commitment, telling myself I'd share the details with her later if there was anything to share. I didn't want her to worry, didn't want her to know how bad things had gotten. Dr. Reeves was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with the kind of calm, measured demeanor that suggested he'd seen everything and nothing surprised him anymore. He reviewed Dr. Cross's notes, asked about my symptoms, my diet, my lifestyle. "Any alcohol consumption?" he asked. "Moderate," I said, which was technically true if you averaged out the Sunday wine sessions across the whole week. "Any family history of gastrointestinal issues?" "Not that I know of." He ordered an endoscopy, a procedure where they'd run a camera down my throat to look at my esophagus and stomach. "Probably just erosive esophagitis from the reflux," he said. "We'll take a look and go from there." The endoscopy was scheduled for 3 weeks later. I spent that time trying to cut back on the wine club participation, but Kenneth had just unveiled his masterpiece, a red blend he'd been aging for 2 years that he was convinced would finally win him recognition. He'd invited the whole family for a special tasting, made it clear that this was important to him, that he needed our honest feedback. I showed up like always, smiled like always, lied like always. The wine tasted like someone had mixed cranberry juice with nail polish remover and aged it in a tire. "Complex," I said, swirling it in my glass like I'd seen people do at real wine tastings. "Really interesting structure, Dad. I think this might be your best yet." Kenneth beamed. Rebecca squeezed my hand under the table, and I felt my throat burn with acid and self-loathing. The endoscopy revealed what Dr. Reeves had suspected: severe erosive esophagitis. My esophagus looked, in his words, like it had been sandblasted. The lining was inflamed, ulcerated in places, showing signs of Barrett's esophagus, a precancerous condition caused by long-term acid exposure. He showed me the images on his computer screen, pointing out the damaged tissue with clinical detachment. "This is serious," he said. "Barrett's esophagus can progress to esophageal cancer if we don't address it aggressively. I need to know if there's anything you're consuming regularly that might be contributing to this level of damage." I sat there in his office, still groggy from the sedation, and I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. "Just normal stuff," I said. "Coffee, maybe some spicy food now and then." He looked skeptical, but didn't push. He prescribed stronger medication, scheduled follow-up biopsies, and sent me home with a stern warning about the importance of dietary modification. I told Rebecca about the Barrett's esophagus that night. Watching her face crumple with worry and guilt was one of the hardest things I'd ever experienced. "Why didn't you tell me it was this bad?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," I said, which was the truth. "I guess I thought it would get better." We sat on our couch in silence for a long time. Neither of us mentioned the wine club. Neither of us acknowledged the elephant in the room. We just sat there, holding each other, knowing that something had to change but not sure how to change it without destroying the fragile peace we'd built with Kenneth. "Maybe you should stop going to the wine club," Rebecca finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "Just for a while, until you're better." But we both knew that wasn't possible. Kenneth would be hurt, would ask questions, would somehow know that his wine was the problem, and then the whole lie would unravel. The follow-up appointment 6 weeks later brought the conversation with Dr. Reeves that would eventually change everything. He'd received the biopsy results, and while there was no cancer yet, the dysplasia, the abnormal cell growth, was concerning. "I need you to level with me," he said, leaning forward in his chair with an intensity that made it clear he wasn't going to accept evasive answers anymore. "Something is causing this level of damage. This isn't just coffee and spicy food. This is consistent with regular exposure to something highly acidic or caustic. Are you drinking something regularly? Some kind of supplement? Homemade remedy? Anything?" I sat there for what felt like an hour but was probably only 30 seconds. And then, in a moment of weakness, or perhaps clarity, I told him everything. About Kenneth, About the wine club, about 6 years of choking down fermented vinegar while pretending it was ambrosia. Dr. Reeves didn't laugh. He didn't even look surprised. "Can you bring me a sample?" he asked. "I want to have it analyzed." I felt my stomach drop. Analyzed? Like in a lab? Yes. If what you're drinking is causing this level of damage, I need to know what's in it. Homemade fermented beverages can contain all sorts of problematic compounds if they're not made properly. High levels of acetic acid, methanol, bacteria, yeast byproducts. I'm not trying to get your father-in-law in trouble, but I need to understand what we're dealing with. He pulled out his prescription pad and wrote something down, then handed it to me. It was a referral to a food safety laboratory, with instructions to have them run a complete chemical analysis. "Please do this," he said, "for your health and possibly for the health of everyone else drinking it." I drove home with the referral burning a hole in my pocket, feeling like I was betraying Kenneth and potentially saving my life at the same time. Rebecca was at work, so I had the house to myself. I went to our wine rack and selected one of Kenneth's more recent vintages, a bottle of his Spring Awakening blend from last month. I packaged it carefully in bubble wrap, filled out the laboratory forms that Dr. Reeves had given me, and scheduled a drop-off for the next day. Then I sat on our couch and stared at the ceiling, wondering what would happen when the results came back. Would they show harmless wine that just happened to taste terrible? Or would they reveal something more sinister, something that would force me to have a conversation with Kenneth that would destroy him? The laboratory results took 2 weeks. Dr. Reeves called me personally, asked me to come to his office as soon as possible. "Don't bring your wife," he said. "Not yet. We need to talk first." That's never something you want to hear from your doctor. I scheduled an appointment for the next day, telling Rebecca I was just going in for a routine follow-up. Dr. Reeves had the laboratory report on his desk when I arrived, multiple pages of chemical analysis that meant nothing to me, but clearly meant something to him. "Sit down," he said, and his tone made my hands start shaking. "The wine your father-in-law is making isn't just bad wine. It's dangerous. The acetic acid content is through the roof, nearly 10 times what you'd find in commercial wine. The pH is insanely low, around 2.5, which is basically vinegar territory. But here's the really concerning part." He turned the report around so I could see it, pointing to a section near the bottom. "There are elevated levels of ethyl carbamate, a known carcinogen that forms during fermentation when certain conditions aren't controlled properly. Not enough to cause immediate harm from occasional exposure, but from what you've told me about your consumption pattern, 6 years of regular exposure, we're talking about significant cumulative risk." I felt the room tilt slightly. "Carcinogen? You mean cancer-causing?" "Yes. Ethyl carbamate is classified as a probable human carcinogen. In combination with the extreme acidity and the chronic reflux damage, you've been creating the perfect conditions for esophageal cancer. The Barrett's esophagus is just the beginning. If you keep drinking this, you will develop cancer. It's not a possibility, it's a probability." The next question came out before I could stop it. "What about everyone else? My wife, her brother, her grandmother?" Dr. Reeves leaned back in his chair. "That depends on their consumption levels and individual susceptibility. But yes, anyone drinking this regularly is at risk. The elderly, people with existing gastrointestinal issues, anyone with compromised immune systems, they'd be especially vulnerable." He slid a business card across the desk. "This is Barbara Nolan. She's an attorney who specializes in food safety and liability cases. I'm not saying you need to sue your father-in-law, but you need to talk to someone about how to handle this situation legally and ethically. And you need to tell your family to stop drinking this stuff immediately." I walked out of Dr. Reeves' office in a daze, the laboratory report and the attorney's business card weighing down my jacket pocket. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, trying to figure out how to tell Rebecca that her father had been poisoning us for 6 years. Not intentionally, obviously. Kenneth thought he was making wine. He had no idea that his fermentation process was producing dangerous levels of toxins. But the outcome was the same. We'd all been drinking poison while smiling and lying and pretending everything was fine. And now I had to be the one to destroy Kenneth's happiness, his purpose, the thing that had given his life meaning since his wife died. I had to be the villain who took away his joy, even though I was really trying to save his family. I called Rebecca from the car. "We need to talk," I said. Tonight, after work, it's about the wine club. I could hear the fear in her voice when she responded. Is it your health? Are you okay? I'm fine, I lied, which was becoming my standard response to everything. But we need to have a serious conversation about your dad's wine. I drove home and spent the rest of the afternoon researching ethyl carbamate, reading medical journals about esophageal cancer risk factors, preparing myself for the conversation that would change everything. When Rebecca got home at 6, I had all the paperwork laid out on our dining room table. The laboratory report, the referral from Dr. Reeves, printouts of the medical research. I'd built a case like I was presenting evidence in court. Rebecca stood in the doorway, staring at the spread of documents. What is all this? She asked. So I told her. Everything. The endoscopy results, the Barrett's esophagus diagnosis, the laboratory analysis showing dangerous levels of toxins in her father's wine. I watched her face go through a progression of emotions: confusion, disbelief, horror, anger, guilt. He doesn't know, she said finally, her voice shaking. Dad has no idea he's been making something dangerous. He thinks he's making wine. He's so proud of it. I know, I said. But that doesn't change the fact that we've been poisoning ourselves for 6 years. And we need to tell him. And we need to tell everyone else who's been drinking it. And we need to make him stop before someone gets seriously hurt. The argument that followed was one of the worst fights of our marriage. Rebecca didn't want to believe it. She kept insisting that the laboratory must have made a mistake, that Dr. Reeves was being overly cautious, that surely if the wine was dangerous, someone would have gotten sick before now. I have gotten sick, I shouted, surprising both of us with the force of my anger. I have Barrett's esophagus. I have precancerous cells in my esophagus from drinking that garbage for 6 years. And I did it to make your father happy, to fit into your family, to be a good husband and son-in-law. But I can't keep doing it. I can't keep pretending. And neither can you, because if something happens to your grandmother, or your brother, or you, because we didn't tell them the truth, how are we supposed to live with that? The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca sat down at the table, picked up the laboratory report, and read through it slowly. I watched her face as the reality sank in. What are we going to tell him? She asked finally. The truth, I said. We have to tell him the truth. But the truth was complicated because the truth meant destroying Kenneth. The wine club was his identity now. He'd spent tens of thousands of dollars on equipment. He'd dedicated his entire basement to this hobby. He talked about his wine at every family gathering, every neighborhood cookout, every conversation with anyone who would listen. Taking that away from him felt cruel, but letting him continue felt worse. We decided to tell Kenneth together, the next day. No Sunday wine club, no audience of family members. Just us, sitting in his living room, explaining why we couldn't drink his wine anymore. I practiced the speech in my head a dozen times that night, trying to find words that would be honest, but kind, truthful, but gentle. I couldn't find them. There was no kind way to tell someone that their pride and joy was toxic, that they'd been unknowingly poisoning their family, that their hobby needed to end immediately. Rebecca barely slept, tossing and turning beside me, and I knew she was dreading the conversation as much as I was. We arrived at Kenneth's house at 10 in the morning. He was surprised to see us, pleased but confused. To what do I owe the pleasure? He asked, ushering us inside. Wine club isn't until tomorrow. We need to talk to you about something important, Rebecca said, her voice already shaking. We sat in his living room, the same room where we'd spent countless Sunday evenings pretending to enjoy his creations, and I pulled out the laboratory report. Dad, I said, I had some of your wine tested. I've been having health problems, and my doctor wanted to know what might be causing them. Kenneth's face went from confusion to concern. Health problems? What kind of health problems? I explained about the heartburn, the erosive esophagitis, the Barrett's esophagus diagnosis. Kenneth's face grew paler with each detail. And the doctor thought my wine was causing this? He asked, his voice small. The laboratory analysis shows dangerous levels of acetic acid and ethyl carbamate, I said, sliding the report across the coffee table. Dr. Reeves says anyone drinking this regularly is at risk for serious health problems. Kenneth picked up the report with shaking hands, his engineering background allowing him to understand the chemical data immediately. I watched the realization hit him, watched his face crumple as he understood what this meant. "I've been poisoning you," he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "All of you. For years." The conversation that followed was brutal in its honesty and devastating in its implications. Kenneth wanted to know every detail, how long I'd been experiencing symptoms, why I hadn't told him sooner, who else might be affected. "Rebecca, have you been feeling okay?" he asked, turning to his daughter with terror in his eyes. "Any heartburn? Any throat problems?" Rebecca admitted she'd had occasional heartburn, but nothing like what I'd experienced. "Daniel?" Kenneth asked. "Oh God, your grandmother. She's 91 if this has hurt her, if I've hurt her." He broke down completely, sitting on his couch with his head in his hands, sobbing like a child. Rebecca and I sat there, not knowing how to comfort him. Watching the man we'd lied to for 6 years finally learn the truth. Kenneth insisted on calling Daniel immediately, right there while we sat in his living room. I listened as he explained the situation, his voice breaking multiple times, apologizing over and over for not knowing, for not being more careful, for assuming that because he'd read books and bought equipment that he actually knew what he was doing. Daniel was silent for a long time, then said he'd get himself checked out, that Amanda had mentioned stomach problems recently, but they'd assumed it was something else. "Tell everyone to stop drinking it," Kenneth said. "Anyone who has any of my wine, bottles I gave them, anything, tell them to throw it out. Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I didn't know." The next call was to his sister Diane, then to his neighbor Gary, then to everyone he'd given wine to over the years. With each call, Kenneth's voice grew weaker, his apologies more desperate. By the time he finished, he looked like he'd aged a decade in the span of an hour. "I need to destroy it all," he said, standing up abruptly. "Every bottle, every barrel, everything in the basement. Right now." He headed for the basement stairs, and Rebecca and I followed, not sure what to do or say. Kenneth's wine sanctuary, his pride and joy, suddenly looked like a tomb. Hundreds of bottles lined the walls, racks of his various vintages stretching back years. Barrels sat in the corner, containing wines still aging. Equipment gleamed in the fluorescent light, thousands of dollars worth of machinery that had produced nothing but poison. Kenneth started pulling bottles off the racks, carrying them to the utility sink in the corner, smashing them and pouring the contents down the drain. The smell of vinegar filled the basement, overwhelming and nauseating. "Dad, stop," Rebecca said, reaching for his arm. "You don't have to do this right now." But Kenneth shook her off, moving with manic energy, bottle after bottle destroyed. Red wine, white wine, rose, dessert wines, everything he'd made over the past 6 years, gone in a frenzy of breaking glass and self-recrimination. I stepped forward to help, thinking that maybe the physical act of destruction would be cathartic for him, but he wouldn't let me. "This is my mess," he said. "Let me clean it up." It took 2 hours to destroy all the bottles. The utility sink couldn't handle the volume, so Kenneth started carrying them upstairs to pour them in the backyard, creating a massive red and white stain on his lawn that looked like a battlefield. Neighbors came out to stare. Gary from 3 houses down, who'd been a regular at Wine Club, approached cautiously. "Kenneth? Everything okay?" Kenneth didn't even look at him. "No, Gary. Nothing is okay. You need to throw out any wine I gave you, all of it. It's not safe to drink." Gary looked at me and Rebecca for confirmation, saw our faces, and backed away slowly. "I'll do that, Kenneth. I'll take care of it." By the time we left Kenneth's house that afternoon, his basement was empty, his backyard was ruined, and he looked like a man who'd lost everything. "I'll have the equipment removed," he said as we stood on his porch. "Donate it, sell it, I don't care. And I need to pay for your medical bills, all of them. The endoscopy, the medications, Dr. Reeves's visits, everything." I started to protest, but he cut me off. "Please, let me do this. It's the least I can do after what I've done to you." Rebecca hugged her father, both of them crying, and I stood there feeling like the worst person alive for being the one who'd brought this truth to light. Even though I knew it was necessary, even though I knew we'd done the right thing, it felt like I'd killed something precious. The fallout spread quickly. Daniel got an endoscopy that revealed mild esophagitis. Amanda had similar symptoms. Rebecca scheduled an appointment with Dr. Reeves, though her symptoms were less severe than mine. Kenneth's sister Diane reported no major issues but was furious that she hadn't been told sooner about the risk. Grandmother Helen, blessedly, had only attended a handful of wine clubs and showed no symptoms, but the fact that she'd been exposed at all sent Kenneth into another spiral of guilt and self-loathing. The neighborhood gossip network lit up with the story of Kenneth Hartley's toxic wine, turning him into a cautionary tale, a well-meaning amateur who'd accidentally poisoned his family and friends. Kenneth retreated from everything. He stopped answering his phone, stopped attending neighborhood events, turned into a recluse in his Victorian house. Rebecca visited him 3 times a week, trying to pull him out of his depression, but he refused to leave his house or engage with anyone beyond brief, monosyllabic responses. "He won't even look at the basement," Rebecca told me after one visit. "He sealed the door. Says he can't stand to see the empty space." I felt guilty about that too, even though intellectually I knew none of this was my fault. I'd just been the one to finally speak the truth that should have been spoken years ago. Dr. Reeves referred me to attorney Barbara Nolan, as promised. I didn't want to pursue legal action, didn't want to add lawsuits to Kenneth's suffering, but Dr. Reeves insisted I at least consult with her about liability concerns. Barbara Nolan's office was downtown, a sleek space with modern furniture and walls covered in framed certifications and awards. She was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed and direct, with the kind of presence that made it clear she didn't waste time on bullshit. "Tell me everything," she said, and I did. The whole story. From that first glass 6 years ago to the laboratory analysis to Kenneth's meltdown. Barbara listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Okay. First, the good news. Your father-in-law almost certainly isn't criminally liable. He had no knowledge that what he was producing was dangerous. This was negligence, not intent. The bad news. If anyone did want to pursue civil action, they'd have a strong case. Serving contaminated food or beverages, even unknowingly, can create liability." She flipped through her notes. "But more importantly, you need to make sure this is documented properly. If your Barrett's esophagus progresses, if you develop cancer, if anyone else develops serious health issues, there needs to be a clear record linking it to the wine exposure. Not for lawsuits necessarily, but for insurance purposes, for medical records, for future treatment." "I don't want to sue Kenneth," I said. "He's my father-in-law. He didn't know." Barbara nodded. "I understand that. And I'm not suggesting you should. But you should be aware of your options and your rights. You've been harmed. Your health has been damaged through no fault of your own. Whether you choose to pursue compensation for that is your decision. But you should make that decision from a place of full information, not from guilt or family obligation." She slid a business card across the desk, a different one this time. "This is Dr. Lillian Torres, a toxicologist who specializes in foodborne illness and contamination cases. I recommend having her review your medical records and the laboratory analysis. She can provide an expert opinion on the extent of the damage and the long-term prognosis." I left Barbara's office feeling more overwhelmed than when I'd arrived. The situation was expanding beyond a simple family problem into something that required lawyers and toxicologists and expert opinions. I met with Dr. Torres 2 weeks later. She was younger than I expected, early 30s, with a doctorate in biochemistry from MIT and a specialty in foodborne carcinogens. She reviewed everything. Dr. Reeves's notes, the endoscopy images, the laboratory analysis of Kenneth's wine, my 6-year history of exposure. "The ethyl carbamate levels are concerning," she said, highlighting sections of the lab report. "Combined with the low pH and the chronic acid exposure, you've basically been bathing your esophageal tissue in a carcinogenic solution twice a week for 6 years. The Barrett's esophagus is an expected outcome. The question is whether we've caught it early enough to prevent progression to adenocarcinoma. And if we haven't?" I asked. Dr. Torres didn't sugarcoat it. "Then you're looking at esophageal cancer within the next 5 to 10 years, possibly sooner. Barrett's with high-grade dysplasia has about a 7% annual risk of progressing to cancer. Your level of dysplasia is currently low-grade, which is better, but still requires very close monitoring. You'll need endoscopies every 6 months, biopsies to check for changes, possibly ablation therapy if the dysplasia worsens. She pulled up something on her computer, turned the screen so I could see it. This is the standard treatment protocol for Barrett's esophagus. You're already on high-dose proton pump inhibitors. The next step, if things progress, would be radiofrequency ablation or endoscopic mucosal resection to remove the abnormal tissue. In worst-case scenarios, partial esophagectomy, surgical removal of the damaged portion of the esophagus. I sat in Dr. Torres's office, looking at diagrams of surgical procedures I might need, feeling the weight of 6 years of polite lies crushing down on me. What about prevention? I asked. What can I do now to minimize the risk? Strict dietary control, she said. No alcohol, no acidic foods, no caffeine, no carbonated beverages. Continue the medications religiously. Maintain a healthy weight. Don't smoke, obviously, and get those surveillance endoscopies every 6 months without fail. Catching changes early is crucial. She printed out a detailed dietary plan, a list of forbidden foods that was basically everything I enjoyed eating or drinking. I know this seems restrictive, she said, handing me the papers, but you're in a fight for your life right now. The Barrett's is a warning sign. How you respond to that warning will determine your outcome. Meanwhile, Kenneth's situation was deteriorating. Rebecca reported that he'd stopped eating properly, was losing weight, seemed disoriented and confused when she visited. I think he's clinically depressed, she said. He needs professional help, but he won't listen to me. So I went to visit him myself, something I'd been avoiding out of guilt and awkwardness. Kenneth answered the door looking like a ghost of himself. He'd lost at least 20 pounds, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. His house, usually immaculate, was a mess. Dishes piled in the sink, mail scattered across the floor, dust covering every surface. You shouldn't have come, Kenneth said, but he let me in anyway. We sat in his living room, the same living room where this had all started 6 years ago, and I tried to find the right words. Kenneth, what happened with the wine wasn't your fault. You didn't know. You were trying to do something nice, to bring the family together. The fact that it turned out badly doesn't change the intention behind it. Kenneth shook his head. I poisoned my own daughter. I poisoned my son-in-law. I gave toxic wine to my mother-in-law, to my sister, to my friends. What kind of person does that? The kind who makes mistakes, I said. The kind who's human. You didn't set out to hurt anyone. You made wine the way you thought it should be made. The process was flawed, but the intention wasn't. It didn't help. Kenneth was beyond the reach of rational argument, lost in a spiral of self-blame that no amount of reassurance could penetrate. I need to make this right, he said. I need to fix what I broke. You can't fix it, I said, more harshly than I intended. What's done is done. I have Barrett's esophagus. That's not going away. But you can move forward. You can be there for Rebecca, for your family. We need you, Kenneth. Hiding in this house, starving yourself, that's not making anything better. He looked at me with such anguish that I had to look away. I don't know how to face anyone, he said. Every time I close my eyes, I see you all drinking that poison, smiling at me, and I want to die. That's when I realized Kenneth needed more help than I could provide. I called Rebecca from Kenneth's kitchen, told her she needed to come over immediately, that her father was in crisis. While we waited, I sat with Kenneth, not talking, just being present. Rebecca arrived 20 minutes later with her brother Daniel. Together, we convinced Kenneth to let us take him to the emergency room for a psychiatric evaluation. He didn't resist, which somehow made it worse. The man who'd been so full of pride and purpose 6 months ago was now passively accepting that he needed emergency mental health care. At the hospital, they admitted him for 72 hours of observation, diagnosed him with major depressive disorder, started him on medication and therapy. The hospitalization became neighborhood news, adding another layer to the story of Kenneth Hartley's toxic wine. People whispered about it at the grocery store, at the post office, anywhere Rebecca or I appeared. Some people were sympathetic, understanding that it was an accident and that Kenneth was suffering enough without additional judgment. Others were less kind, treating Kenneth like a pariah, avoiding his house, crossing the street when they saw him. Gary, the neighbor who'd been such a regular at Wine Club, stopped speaking to Kenneth entirely, convinced that his own recent stomach problems were Kenneth's fault. The social isolation only deepened Kenneth's depression. Rebecca suggested I start a support group, something to help Kenneth and others who'd been affected process what had happened. Maybe if Dad could talk to other people who understand, who aren't judging him, it would help, she said. So I reached out to Daniel, to Amanda, to Diane, to everyone who'd been part of Wine Club. We met at our house, 9 people sitting in our living room, talking about the experience of being slowly poisoned by someone who loved us. It was therapeutic, in a strange way, acknowledging the absurdity of it, the tragedy, the complicated emotions. We'd all lied, we'd all pretended, we'd all enabled Kenneth's delusion because we loved him and wanted him to be happy. And now, we were all dealing with the consequences. Kenneth joined us for the 3rd meeting, his first public appearance since the hospitalization. He looked better, more stable, though still haunted. He sat in our living room surrounded by his victims, his family, and apologized formally. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry for being so absorbed in my hobby that I didn't question whether I was doing it correctly. I'm sorry for not knowing what I didn't know. I'm sorry for hurting all of you." There was silence for a moment, then Diane spoke. "Kenneth, we lied to you for years. We told you the wine was good when it wasn't. We're all complicit in this. You made mistakes, but so did we." That meeting was a turning point. Kenneth began engaging with therapy more seriously, started rebuilding his social connections, slowly emerged from the depression that had nearly destroyed him. He sold all his winemaking equipment, donated the money to a charity focused on food safety education. He converted his basement from a fermentation laboratory into a woodworking shop, finding a new hobby that couldn't accidentally poison anyone. He took courses on fermentation science, finally learning what he should have learned before he started making wine, not to resume the hobby, but to understand where he'd gone wrong. "I was so arrogant," he told me months later. "I thought because I was an engineer, because I could read books and buy equipment, that I could master something that people spend decades learning. I didn't respect the craft, and people got hurt because of it." My health became a long-term project. Dr. Reeves kept me on high-dose proton pump inhibitors, scheduled endoscopies every 6 months to monitor the Barrett's esophagus. The first follow-up showed no progression, which was good news. The second showed slight improvement in the inflammation. By the 1-year mark, Dr. Reeves was cautiously optimistic. "The dysplasia hasn't worsened," he said, reviewing the biopsy results. "If we can keep it stable for the next few years, your cancer risk drops significantly. You're not out of the woods yet, but you're heading in the right direction." The dietary restrictions became my new normal. No more coffee, no more spicy food, no more anything that might irritate my damaged esophagus. I learned to live with it, the same way I'd learned to live with Sunday Wine Club, except this time the restrictions were actually helping me instead of slowly killing me. Rebecca and I grew closer through the ordeal, in the way that shared trauma can either destroy a relationship or forge it into something stronger. We'd survived the lie, the revelation, the fallout. We'd navigated Kenneth's breakdown and recovery together. We'd learned that honesty, even painful honesty, was better than polite deception. "I should have said something sooner," Rebecca admitted one night as we lay in bed. "I knew the wine was terrible. I knew you were suffering, but I couldn't bring myself to hurt Dad. We both made that choice," I said, "and we both paid for it. But we're here now, and we're okay, and that's what matters." Kenneth's recovery took the better part of a year. Therapy, medication, rebuilding his sense of purpose and identity outside of winemaking. He started volunteering at a local food bank, channeling his engineer's mind into logistics and organization. He reconnected with old colleagues from his aerospace days, people he'd lost touch with during his winemaking obsession. He started traveling, taking trips he'd put off to focus on his hobby. Slowly, the man we'd known before the wine began to reemerge, older and sadder, but also wiser and more humble. "I spent 6 years trying to create something perfect," he told me, "and all I created was suffering. Now I'm trying to just be present, to help where I can, to not overthink everything." The neighborhood eventually moved on to other gossip, other dramas. Kenneth's toxic wine became a story people told at parties, a cautionary tale about amateur fermentation gone wrong. Some people still avoided him, but most had forgiven or forgotten. Rebecca's book club started meeting at Kenneth's house again, though now they drank store-bought wine or just tea. Sunday dinners resumed, though without the wine club ritual. We'd gather at Kenneth's house, eat good food, talk about our lives. And Kenneth would sometimes reference the wine situation with dark humor. "Remember when I was poisoning you all?" he'd say with a wry smile. Good times. Dr. Torres followed up with me periodically, tracking my case as part of a research study on foodborne carcinogens and long-term health outcomes. "You're lucky," she told me during one consultation. "If you'd waited another year before getting diagnosed, if the Barretts had progressed further, we'd be having a very different conversation right now." She was writing a paper about the case, with my permission, hoping to raise awareness in the medical community about the dangers of improperly fermented beverages. "Home fermentation is becoming increasingly popular," she explained. "Beer, wine, kombucha, all of it. Most people do it safely, but some don't. And when they don't, the consequences can be severe. Your case illustrates that perfectly." 2 years after the revelation, I got the news I'd been hoping for. My latest endoscopy showed no dysplasia. The Barrett's esophagus was still present. Scarring from 6 years of damage doesn't just disappear, but the abnormal cells were gone. "This is as good an outcome as we could hope for," Dr. Reeves said. "You'll still need monitoring, probably for the rest of your life, but your cancer risk has dropped dramatically. You basically hit the reset button." I left his office feeling lighter than I had in years, called Rebecca from the parking lot to share the news. She cried with relief, and I realized that she'd been carrying the weight of this too, worrying that her father's wine might eventually kill me. Kenneth took the news hard in a different way, his relief mixed with renewed guilt. "I'm glad you're okay," he said when I told him. "But I can't forget that you almost weren't, that you spent 6 years being slowly poisoned because you were too polite to tell me my wine tasted like vinegar." "Actually," I said, "it tasted like vinegar mixed with regret." Kenneth stared at me for a moment, then burst out laughing, the first real laugh I'd heard from him in 2 years. "That's exactly what it tasted like," he said. "How did you drink it for so long?" "Because I loved Rebecca," I said, "and because I wanted you to be happy, and because sometimes we do stupid things for the people we care about." The story made its way into the local news eventually, a human interest piece about the dangers of home fermentation and the importance of proper training. They interviewed Dr. Reeves, Dr. Torres, even me, though I kept Kenneth's identity anonymous. The reporter, Jessica Kim from the local NBC affiliate, framed it as a cautionary tale, but also a story of family resilience. "A family nearly torn apart by homemade wine finds healing through honesty and professional help," the headline read. Kenneth watched the broadcast from his living room, Rebecca and I sitting on either side of him. "They made it sound inspiring," he said, "like we're some kind of triumph over adversity story." "We are," Rebecca said. "We survived. That's worth something." 3 years after the revelation, Kenneth threw a party. Not a wine club, never that again, but a celebration of his 75th birthday. Everyone came. Rebecca and me, Daniel and Amanda, Diane, even Gary from down the street, grudges finally set aside. Kenneth's house was full of laughter and good food and store-bought wine that actually tasted like wine. In the middle of the party, Kenneth tapped his glass and called for everyone's attention. "I wanted to thank you all for being here," he said, "and I wanted to apologize one more time for the wine situation. I know we've moved past it, but I need you all to know that I think about it every day. I think about the harm I caused unintentionally, and it motivates me to be better, to be more careful, to never assume I know everything about anything." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "But I also want to thank you for lying to me. I know that sounds strange, but you all lied because you loved me. You drank terrible wine for years because you wanted me to be happy. That's something precious, even if it nearly killed you." Everyone laughed, the tension breaking. "I don't recommend that approach going forward," Kenneth continued. "Honesty is definitely better, but the fact that you cared enough to suffer through my vinegar concoctions, that means something to me. So thank you. Thank you for loving me enough to lie. and thank you for loving me enough to eventually tell the truth. I stood in Kenneth's living room, surrounded by family and friends, and realized that the 6 years of pretending hadn't been entirely wasted. Yes, we'd made mistakes. Yes, I'd damaged my health. Yes, Kenneth had spiraled into depression and self-loathing. But we'd survived it. We'd come through the other side stronger, more honest, more aware of our capacity for both deception and healing. The Barrett's esophagus would always be part of my medical history, a reminder of the price of polite lies. But it would also be a reminder that sometimes the hardest conversations are the most necessary. Kenneth pulled me aside later in the evening, away from the crowd. "I've been talking to my therapist about making amends," he said. "Real amends, not just apologies. I want to pay for all your medical expenses, everything related to the Barrett's diagnosis and treatment. I know it can't undo the damage, but I need to do something tangible." I started to protest, but he held up his hand. "Please, let me do this. I need to. Dr. Reeves, Dr. Torres, all the endoscopies, the medications, everything. I have the money from selling the equipment and my retirement savings. Let me put it to good use." I agreed finally, because I realized Kenneth needed this as much as I needed the financial help. The medical bills had been mounting, my insurance covering most but not all of the specialized care. Kenneth wrote a check that covered everything, past and future, enough to ensure that no matter what happened with my health, the financial burden wouldn't add to the stress. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. Not just for the money, but for everything. For teaching me that family is complicated and messy and worth fighting for, even when it's hard. The final chapter of the story came 4 years after the revelation. My latest endoscopy showed complete resolution of the inflammation, no Barrett's changes, healthy esophageal tissue. "This is remarkable," Dr. Reeves said, comparing images from 4 years ago to the current ones. "The human body's capacity for healing never ceases to amaze me. You did everything right, stopped the exposure, managed the symptoms aggressively, followed the treatment plan religiously. This is the best possible outcome." He cleared me to annual checkups instead of every 6 months. "You're not completely out of the woods," he cautioned. "Barrett's can recur, and you'll always need monitoring. But you've essentially reversed years of damage through proper care and abstinence from the causative agent." I shared the news with Kenneth over coffee at his house, in the basement-turned-woodworking shop where wine barrels used to sit. He'd made me a cutting board as a gift, beautiful maple wood with dovetail joints, the work of someone who'd finally found a hobby that brought joy without consequences. "I'm glad you're okay," he said simply. "I'm glad we're all okay." We sat in comfortable silence, drinking properly made coffee, surrounded by the smell of sawdust instead of fermentation. "Do you ever miss it?" I asked. "The winemaking?" Kenneth thought about it. "Sometimes I miss the community of it, the ritual, but not the wine itself. I know now that I was terrible at it, that I was creating something harmful. I don't miss that. I miss Sunday wine club sometimes," I admitted. Not the wine, obviously, but the gathering, the routine, the sense of belonging. Kenneth nodded. "We can still do that. Sunday dinners without the poison. Just family, good food, store-bought beverages that won't kill anyone." So that's what we did. Every other Sunday, rotating between our houses, the family would gather. Kenneth would cook, his engineering precision translating surprisingly well to following recipes. Rebecca would bring dessert. Daniel and Amanda would handle cleanup. And we'd talk and laugh and argue and love each other, honestly this time, without the weight of unspoken truths poisoning the air. The story of Kenneth's wine became family legend, the kind of story we'd tell at holidays with dark humor and relief that it had all turned out okay. "Remember when Grandpa almost killed everyone with his hobby?" Future grandchildren would probably say. And we'd laugh and tell them about the importance of training, of humility, of admitting when you don't know what you're doing before someone gets hurt. But we'd also tell them about love, about sacrifice, about the complicated ways families navigate dysfunction and emerge stronger on the other side. 5 years after the revelation, I stood in my classroom teaching chemistry, explaining fermentation processes to a group of skeptical teenagers. "Fermentation is a powerful tool," I told them. "It's given us bread, beer, wine, cheese, countless foods that have sustained humanity for millennia. But it's also dangerous if you don't respect the science. Improper fermentation can produce toxins, carcinogens, compounds that will make you sick or worse. A student raised her hand. Is this like a personal story, Mr. Brennan? I smiled. Let's just say I have first-hand experience with why you should leave fermentation to the professionals, or at least to amateurs who actually know what they're doing. The Barrett's esophagus remained in my medical records, a permanent reminder of 6 years of polite lies and one catastrophic truth. But it was stable, dormant, no longer an active threat. I took my medications, followed my dietary restrictions, and got my annual checkups. And every Sunday, when I sat at Kenneth's table, drinking safely manufactured beverages and eating food that wouldn't give me cancer, I thought about how close we'd come to losing everything: my health, Kenneth's sanity, our family bonds. But we'd survived. We'd told the truth when it mattered most. And we'd learned that sometimes the hardest act of love is being willing to hurt someone in order to save them. Kenneth never made wine again. His basement remained a woodworking shop, producing beautiful, non-toxic furniture that he gave as gifts or sold at local craft fairs. He found peace in working with his hands, creating something tangible and useful and safe. I like that wood doesn't lie, he told me once. If the joint is weak, you can see it. If the finish is bad, you can feel it. There's no pretending with woodwork. It's honest in a way winemaking never was for me. I understood what he meant. The wine had been built on mutual deception, everyone lying to everyone else in an elaborate dance of politeness and love gone wrong. The woodwork was real, solid, something you could trust. The final piece of the story came 6 years after the revelation, when Dr. Reeves published a case study about my experience in a medical journal. He'd changed my name, protected my identity, but the story was mine. 6 years of exposure to improperly fermented wine, Barrett's esophagus, near miss with cancer, complete resolution through cessation and treatment. Patient presence as a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers of amateur fermentation and the importance of direct communication with patients about all possible sources of chronic acid exposure, the abstract read. Dr. Torres cited it in her own research paper about foodborne carcinogens. Barbara Nolan used it as an example in food safety seminars she taught to aspiring artisan food producers. Kenneth read the case study, recognized himself in every detail despite the anonymization. "We're famous," he said with dark humor, "the toxic wine family." But there was pride in his voice too, pride that something good had come from the disaster, that other people might learn from our mistakes. "If this prevents even one person from poisoning their family," he said, "then maybe it was worth it." I disagreed. The 6 years of damage to my esophagus, the chronic health monitoring I'd need for the rest of my life, Kenneth's year of severe depression, the strain on our family, none of that was worth it. But I understood what he meant. We'd turned tragedy into education, suffering into awareness. That was something. The final Sunday dinner of that 6th year was unremarkable in the best possible way. We gathered at Kenneth's house, ate good food, drank safe beverages, talked about ordinary things. No drama, no crisis, no hidden toxins slowly destroying us from the inside. Just family, complicated and messy and deeply imperfect, doing our best to love each other honestly. Kenneth raised his glass of store-bought wine, real wine that had been made by professionals who knew what they were doing. "A toast," he said, "to honesty, to health, and to never again pretending to like something that tastes like vinegar mixed with regret." We all laughed and clinked our glasses, and I took a sip of actual wine for the first time in 6 years, Dr. Reeves having cleared me for occasional, moderate consumption. It tasted like wine, just wine, and it was perfect. If you enjoyed this, you TM will definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.